All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for breaking down barriers connecting the Academy with the broader community. I'm Riley Catanacci. I'm a fifth year PhD student in the neuroscience department, and I'm so excited to be here joined by our three panelists who have extensive and diverse experiences breaking down barriers in academia. First, we have Dr. Sarah Heminger, who is a social entrepreneur, scientist, and co-founder of Thread, which is a nonprofit that leverages the power of relationships to support exceptional young people facing significant opportunity and achievement gaps. Next, we have Dr. Angel Smothers, who is the Associate Dean of Community Engagement at West Virginia University, an alumnus of their School of Nursing. She's dedicated to establishing nurse-led access points to healthcare in some of the most impoverished areas of West Virginia. And Dr. Humara Ziad is a senior lecturer of Islamic studies here at Johns Hopkins University, and she's active in multiple community groups that sit at the intersection of art, religion, health, and justice, such as the Faith in Vaccine Project and the 99 Vessels Poetry Project. And she's also the author of a book entitled Words to Live By: Sacred Sources for Interreligious Engagement. So thank you again for being here, and I'm very excited to see where this conversation leads today. Just a couple of reminders for our audience. We're going to start with a moderated discussion, but feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat, either on Whova or on Zoom, and I'll do my best to incorporate them. And then at the end, we should have time for a general Q&A. All right, so to start us off, I'd love to ask each of you about the specific catalyst that got you started bridging your experiences within the Academy with the broader community. So how did you get started and what was your inspiration? Maybe Dr. Heminger, we can start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be with you. So Thread was founded now 20 years ago when I was in my first year of graduate school. And at the time, I think I felt extremely isolated. I did not have friends. I felt like I was an imposter and didn't really belong. I'm introverted and didn't have family in the area. So I describe it as like my quarter life crisis, where I was just trying to figure out where I belonged. And a lot of that came from things that I had not really dealt with from my childhood. So I was born not breathing with birth injuries that were so traumatic for my parents that my father, who's a plumber, decided that he would never let another physician deliver one of his children. So he delivered my two younger siblings in my parents' bedroom. Fast forward, when I was around 8, I was abducted in the middle of the night from my childhood home, and I'm part of this, small group of kids in the 80s who was fortunate enough to come home from an abduction alive. And then around that same time, my parents found out the pastor of our church was misusing money. And when they revealed that to the congregation, instead of firing the pastor, they decided they would shun our family. So from the time I was 8 to the time I was 16, I would go to church sometimes 3 days a week, and no one was supposed to speak to me, not just adults or kids, but my own family, my aunts and uncles, my cousins. And so I think all of that I hadn't yet dealt with, combined with what I felt was the isolation for me of graduate school, is really what prompted Thread. And so I was trying to find my people, and I'm like, where do I find my people? And that's where it connects to my husband's journey. He had been in a really, difficult situation in his upbringing, where his mom was in a bad car accident. And a week later, a second one, she couldn't walk, so she couldn't work. She lost her job. They ended up losing their house, and she became depressed and addicted to Dilaudid, and then began selling drugs to support her own habit. And this all coincided with his transition into high school. So he had failed he'd failed his whole freshman year, missed more than 30 days of school, and was going to drop out. And a group of teachers were just like, yeah, no. So they would pick him up for school and bring him lunch and make sure he had a place to do his laundry. And so when I was trying to find my people, I just happened to be stopped at a streetlight at the corner of Caroline and Orleans, and saw Dunbar High School right next to Hopkins, and thought, oh, I get along with my husband. I bet there's other brilliant, capable kids at Dunbar that maybe are distracted by things happening outside of the school day. And I figured if I could get along with him, I could find my people there. So that has been the case. 20 years later, my closest friends are our alumni from that first cohort. They're also my bosses on our board of directors. They're my colleagues on our staff. So I did find my people, and it's been an incredible journey to do so. But our kind of reaching out and getting more connected was just to really help myself at the core of it.
Thanks so much for sharing. That was people are commenting in the chat, like very enlightening, and I appreciate your vulnerability. So Dr. Ziad, could we continue with you?
Absolutely. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing that. I think it really does underscore that that so much of the work that we all do comes from us. It comes from where we've been. And it's often a cry to find some space within. I mean, the way I see it for myself is a space of healing within my own self, actually, and to always be aware of that space within us. So thank you so much. It's in my story also starts with myself and with my own experiences. The last 3 generations of my family grew up in 3 different countries, India, and then after the partition, Pakistan, and then the United States. So much of my family is all over the world. I experienced a lot of racism and xenophobia as a child in an all-white neighborhood in Northern Virginia, in the United States. And I also grew up in a family that had a very strong post-colonial analysis to make sense of racism and white supremacy and neocolonialism. My mom had been a leftist political organizer in Pakistan. She raised us with those ideas of taking matters into your own hands, of taking seriously all the different skills and practices that people bring to movements. And she also brought those ideas into how she and my father taught us about religion. So I'm a professor of religion, but especially we were raised within Islamic spiritual traditions, and this idea that knowledge merely for the sake of knowledge is most likely to become a project of the ego, but that knowledge should always be moving towards an end. It's an end that is both within ourselves and outside ourselves, that it's knowledge to build character, it's knowledge to build ourselves from within, to heal ourselves, and then knowledge to actually grow relationships of trust within our communities, and then finally trust and care both, and then finally knowledge to create social change. So that was such a part of my childhood growing up. I also had the opportunity before the age of 13 to live in South Asia, to live in East Africa, and to live in North America. And I saw how so many stories were missing from our American educational system at a really young age. Obviously, I had that privilege of being able to see that, and that the impact of this was a devastating lack of empathy in our people, and a way and tools to really dehumanize others without really understanding or having any sense of where others were coming from. And then finally, my adult entry point into bridging this work of university and community was through 9/11. And that's a story that a lot of us from my generation have. So I was an early graduate student, also like Sarah, feeling a lot of isolation in grad school anyway. Grad school was a deeply isolating time for many, many reasons, and we can go into that, imposter syndrome, all of that. But I was an early grad student when 9/11 happened. I was studying Islam. I lived near New York City, and of course I was thrust into activism. It wasn't really even a choice. I mean, I would have gone that way anyway, but many of us weren't even given a choice necessarily. And so as I began working really closely with justice communities, in educational activism, cultural activism, narrative change work, during the War on Terror, and that was really, along my grad school was happening while the War on Terror was really gaining in speed, and we saw the stripping of our civil liberties. We saw the growth of a surveillance state. And at that point, I just became more and more convinced that the goal of teaching is is education for critical consciousness. And that's, of course, quoting Paulo Freire, who's the wonderful Brazilian educator and liberation theologian. So I firmly believe that education, from that point on, that education should raise awareness of oppression and self-oppression, that it should provide us the tools to dismantle it. And for me, and eventually the goal was to grow in empathy for one another. It's always been empathy. That's always been like, hey, can we learn to step into each other's shoes? And for me, the way to do that is, in teaching religious studies, of course, has been to connect my students with the living narratives of the communities that they're learning about, and then eventually to move into relationships of solidarity and allyship. And I know there's more controversy around that, service learning as solidarity and allyship. But for me, I found that has been a beautiful way for students to really learn empathy. So I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear that full circle narrative about your upbringing and how all of those experiences in early life can really play into the work that we do now. So Dr. Smothers, would you be able to tell us a little bit about your experience?
So I grew up in a coal camp in southern West Virginia, which West Virginia is the only state that's fully within the Appalachian region. I don't know if y'all watched October Sky, Homer Hickam and the Rocket Boys, but if you watched that movie, Homer's coal camp was just a few miles over the mountain from mine. We had one car in the holler. We all had to use the car. There was about 40 families. And so when I thought about going to college, I thought it's not going to happen. But it did. There was a historically Black college that had a nursing program. And so we all rode together to get out of the holler to go to the college. And so from there, I continued my education. And just like the other presenters, the panelists, when you get beyond the things that you experience as a young person, you're able to turn and face those people that are still trapped in that situation. And that's when you think about community engagement, that is really what it's about. It's about identifying the needs, meeting the people where they are and going there for them. And so as I completed my undergraduate nursing education and then graduate, my goal was to always turn back to the people. And so you'll hear in my future responses during this presentation that kind of how I did that. So
thank you so much. So maybe jumping right in then, as you laid such a great transition moment, could you talk about maybe the biggest barriers that you faced in engaging in this kind of work, and how you were able to overcome that? Maybe Dr. Smothers, we can start with you. Yeah.
Sure. So what the focus of my scholarly engagement work over the last decade has been in building nurse-led access to care points within faith communities out in the little coal camps throughout Appalachia. So those isolated coal camp communities where there's limited access to care, limited transportation, everyone's living in poverty, limited running water, sewer still goes into the creek, those types of communities. And so over the past decade, we at West Virginia University School of Nursing have been building nurse-led access to care points in those churches. We can't go there and do the work because we're considered outsiders. So in Appalachia, you gotta be an insider. And so we identify nurses within those faith communities. Doesn't have to be a church. It's any faith background where a nurse would like to raise up and serve that faith community. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is in identifying the nurses, training and equipping them. So barrier-wise, finding nurses who are interested in this work, but then also finding nurses who are connected to those communities so that they're viewed as insiders and it's easier to engage them. So that's been some barriers that we've encountered.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. Heminger, could you maybe touch on some barriers that you faced at Thread?
Sure. So first, just a little bit of our core model. So what is it what is the work that we do at Thread? So we are working to bring people together across lines of difference and do it in a way where each human being feels truly seen and known and loved. So the way we do that is we enroll high school freshmen who rank academically in the bottom 25% of their class, and then we make a 10-year commitment to them. Once they're enrolled in Thread, we never unenroll a young person, and then they are matched with, similar to the relationship between my husband's teachers, who are still friends with now, some of them in their 80s and 90s, there's up to 4 adults that are paired and matched with that young person and their entire family. And so the way we describe it is, it could be rides to school, it could be packed lunch, but over the course of time, they do life together. And so what we started seeing early on was just numbers that from like a scientific point of view were staggering. So if you look at high school freshmen in Baltimore City who have GPAs of less than 1.0 in their freshman year, and again, like the average incoming GPA for Thread students is a 0.76. Only 6% graduate from high school in 4 years. And in Thread, that number is 74%. And it doesn't matter if it takes 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, we stick with them to help them accomplish their goals. And so we started asking the question, like, why is this, what's happening? Why is this working? And we can distill our lessons from 2 decades into 2 things. The first is that the quantity of connection matters. So just the number of touch points between a young person and those volunteers allows us to project, for example, if a young person is going to graduate from high school. But the second thing is the more important, and I think relevant to this conversation, which is when we interviewed 79 of our early young people and volunteers, and we said, just what is happening when you go on this ride to school? Like, tell us about it. Like, qualitatively, we want to understand what is going on. What they described was that at first it was the volunteer showing up to be the helper. So giving the ride to school, for example. Over 20, 30, 40 rides to school, they both started to describe feeling very known by the other person. And then if you go out further in time, what they both began to articulate is that the volunteer was beginning to ask the young person for their help. So it was that reorientation from I'm the helper to we both have something to learn and gain from each other that was the transformative aspect of what we do. And so to your question about barriers, we thought, oh, great, we just have to teach adults how to be vulnerable and like be their full selves. And it turns out that's really hard to do because we're all taught, put on the mask, be as perfect as you possibly can. And so our work has really been about how do you not just train and coach individuals to show up in this way, but how do you model that behavior? Because you can train and coach all you want, but if you aren't modeling it, then it's really hard to get the work done. And just the last thing I'll say on this is after stepping back, when you think about all the things that structural racism has done, all of the harm it has caused, it has basically told our young people that they're, disadvantaged, marginalized, at risk. There's a narrative that's overlaid that basically says to our young people, you can never be the helper. And when you think about it, just from a neuroscience point of view, we are all hardwired to want to help. You get dopamine, your cortisol goes down. Like, it is innate to the human condition to want to be in community with other people. And that's something that has been taken. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is just in the interpersonal relationships, not just reflect to our young people and to everyone in our community that they matter, but that we actually need them. And that is a deeper thing, but it's the thing that we see actually drives the most change.
Yeah, that brings up an interesting point, this kind of perspective switch too, from becoming the helper to receiving help. So actually, Dr. Ziad, if I could ask you to maybe switch gears a little bit. And I think many people, when they're trying to do outreach work, especially from the point of academia, think, okay, I'm going to go out there and do this thing for the community. Could you talk about maybe some ways that the community can help us as academics, or that the relationship can be a little bit more reciprocal.
Absolutely. So this is, there has been a real shift in the university too. And I see this at Hopkins, at the Center for Social Concern is our main service learning organization. And I'm a faculty fellow there. I have been as well before this year. And there's been a shift in the traditional model of service learning, which was really rooted in aspects of charity that we're doing for someone. It was rooted in benevolence. It was rooted in some kind of an acknowledgement and almost a recreation of a power differential, that somehow this power differential was status quo, and we're not changing that. Like, that's the way it is, and we are doing good for someone else. And that's really moved into a model of critical service learning, which is rooted in solidarity. And it's how do we collaboratively empower each other for collective gain? How are we working together? It's a problem-solving approach. We're hearing that from all of our participants here, that is actually leveraging the collaborative resources, the creativity of the university, as well as the communities that hold it. And this is where understanding that that expertise comes in many forms, that multiple perspectives are necessary for any kind of methodological integrity, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in research, the establishing relationships of equity, that we're not going out into the community. We are the community. We are, in fact, all in a symbiotic relationship. And to understand, especially in the case of a place like Hopkins, that the university has had a deeply extractive relationship with the community that holds it for so many years, that it is a matter also of creating, of righting that wrong, of reparations as well in the conversations that we are having now about critical service learning. For at least, I focus on this kind of work for teaching. And for me, for example, we had, there's a project that I did with Hopkins undergrads called Faith in the Vaccine. It was a collaboration with Interfaith America, as well as American Muslim Health Professionals. It's an organization that advocates. And we had a cohort of Hopkins students who were working with faith-based organizations around the country to around education and access to the COVID vaccine. And the work that they did, and this is for all kinds of critical service learning, is developing the skills for communication, developing the skills for deep listening, developing the skills of perseverance, developing the skills of flexibility, of actually what does it mean when you have a real world challenge of working with organizations that lack resources. This relationship that went on for 8 months, where these students, different cohorts of students, were working with different organizations, was something that they could never have experienced in the classroom. While they were learning while they were studying in a classroom, while they were engaging with me, while they were engaging with another educator through this whole process, the skills that they gained and the ways in which they understood how different forms of knowledge, different forms of expertise, they had never seen that kind of thing before. They'd never experienced that kind of thing before. So for me, I think that while the university we're still not in a place where universities are see the importance of this work, but there is a level of transformative learning that comes from these collaborations that is not possible in the classroom.
And Dr. Smothers, you have some experience on the university side leading the community engagement efforts at West Virginia University. Do you have any additional thoughts on this relationship between academia and the community?
So West Virginia University is a land grant institution. And so a part of our obligation is to build reciprocal community engagement efforts. And so when I say reciprocal, a part of that means that we don't go to the community and do. We allow the community to tell us what they need first. And so oftentimes, and nurses are guilty of this too, but oftentimes we decide what somebody needs. We say, this is what they need. What we're finding in Appalachia is that if you approach it from that standpoint, you get the door. Like, they're not opening their door to you. And so we start by identifying what their perceived needs are. And once we work with them to meet those needs, they'll listen to us on what we think they need. And so we use evidence that will allow us to make a change and bring about a change, but we don't solely approach it from the evidence. We let the community make that decision. And so as a land grant institution, the goal is reciprocal engagement. So we're not doing to, we're engaging with. And so, here in Appalachia, especially in the coal camp region of Southern West Virginia, there's been a lot of exploitation. And so people are fearful. There's a lack of trust among community members. And so we seek out ways to build rapport and engage the people in a way that is sustainable, if that kind of answers that question.
Absolutely. I think you both highlighted the importance of relationship in doing outreach efforts, which kind of leads me to another question, which is, obviously we're trying to build relationships and really engage in the community, but at some points there is value to trying to quantify kind of impacts, as you alluded to, Dr. Smothers, to gain trust. Dr. Heminger, you talked about kind of tracking these metrics with Thread. Could you talk about effective strategies for doing so and what the benefits are to measuring and kind of keeping track of your impact in some way?
Sure. I think probably so from the very beginning, because we were founded as a student group at Hopkins by a group of graduate and medical students, we're all a bunch of nerds. So we've been tracking pretty much everything from the beginning. In fact, probably tracking too many things. So we started by looking at things like attendance rates, GPAs, credits earned, high school graduation. And what we found was that was deeply flawed in a number of ways. While those measurements are important, what we found is that our young people were graduating from high school, they were going to college, they were graduating from college, and then they were still walking into a world that is not meant for them. And so about 10 years into our existence, our alumni started asking, like, how might we change the culture and climate of the entire city of Baltimore? And I was like, that's very ambitious. It's actually somewhat straightforward to help a young person graduate from high school. To change the culture and climate of a city is an entirely different thing. And so we really began focusing in on developing curricular content where the change that we're actually driving towards is, can we see improved conditions for belonging? And it's first and foremost in the relationships in the Thread community. But, when you think about, let me give you a quick example would be Bronfenbrenner's model from 1977. He makes the case that you can only have sustained change if you have it in 5 domains simultaneously: intrapersonal, interpersonal, institutional, community, and policy. And so, a lot of where things are broken right now is there's been, and rightfully so, a focus on policy, but policy in the absence of the other 4 just doesn't work. We saw that with for example, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which was intended to integrate schools, but we hadn't done the inner work as individuals, as families, as a community. And so you just had white flight out of the city followed by middle-class Black flight. And so now if you look at the two historically African-American high schools, Douglas and Dunbar, they're actually more segregated than they were in 1954 because they're segregated by race and by class. And so, it's how do we do it concurrently? And a critical piece of it is that middle one, institutions. And so I like to joke, people ask my affiliation with Hopkins. I say I'm in my 25th year because I've been a member of the Hopkins community since I was 18 years old. I was an undergrad and then graduate student. Now I'm adjunct faculty. So I'm part of Thread and Hopkins. And, so a lot of the work we do is we actually work with, Thread works with, for example, it started with the Department of Biomedical Engineering because that was my, home department. We actually do their faculty retreats. We teach semester-long courses on these skills of how to understand yourself and to bridge and bond. And what we're starting to see in our qualitative metrics is that inside of the department, we are creating better conditions for belonging. And so that matters to us so much, not because we want the department to have strong relationships and get to more equitable outcomes, but it means that when our young people then go and intern in one of the labs in the department over the summer, they're walking into a space that's actually meant for them. And so for us, it's like all of it. And we're focused in a very place-based way with our unit of change being the city of Baltimore. It's a lot of why we've kept our focus in a single geography, is that it's that broader, ambitious goal that our young people have really brought forth and driven, which is like, how do we change the culture and climate of a city? And before we can do that, we've got to change the culture and climate of the institutions that are in the city.
Absolutely. That connects well to a question that someone put in the chat, which was, how do you find hope when change is so slow and advocacy work doesn't lead to imminent results? Obviously, Thread has been going on for a while, so I'm sure you can speak to that. But maybe Dr. Ziad, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, that is a wonderful question, and I'm struggling with that myself every day. I find hope in the relationships created. I find hope in the small things. This is not to sound trite, but that is exactly what it is. That a lot of the work that we are doing and that we're advocating for, in all of us on this call, is work that we may not see the fruits of in our generation or beyond. And that is just a reality. And so for me, it is where I think for me, the political becomes personal, in that it is really about the small wins. It's about the relationships that are built in the work. It is about, if my personal goal is to create a place where we all see ourselves in each other, then seeing little pieces of that grow in the midst of incredible tragedy, in the midst of incredible setbacks, is what keeps it going. If I see that I have personally changed and become a more understanding human being over the course of the work, if I see that in the people I work with, if I see that reflected back to me in this work, then that is what gives me hope. There are, we do see, as a historian, I also know that there were cycles, right? I mean, we've seen that in civil rights. We've seen that that there are cycles, that we gain rights, we lose rights, we gain rights, we lose rights. And that is also cycles of human history. It has to do with human psychology. It has to do with, just as we're saying, how slowly a person may change. Institutions take longer to change. Societies take even longer to change. So, having a realistic theory of change, knowing that things take time, and taking hope in those small moments where what we are aiming for on a society-wide level we see reflected in our smaller communities. That gives me hope.
Dr. Smothers, how about you?
I think this is probably my favorite question anyone's ever asked me, because I think about this every day, but I'm in denial that I'm not the only one struggling with it. I think, and sometimes I get up and I think, you know what? We can do this. West Virginia leads the nation in the bad health-related outcomes. And so, building these nurse-led access to care points has been something that I have felt could improve these outcomes. But then when you go into the cold camps, you start to lose hope. You think that we're never going to make a change. This isn't going to happen. And it's that doubt that sinks in, and it makes you, there's days where you're like, what's the point? But it's moving forward, even if it's at a slow pace, it's moving forward. It's opening the eyes of the younger generation to see where we've been, where we are now, and then build a vision for where we need to go. And so in West Virginia, when we get the report card that says, we're still really bad in the health-related outcomes, we look at the wins. We find the positive pieces. And so it is a challenge. And I think that, what I'm hearing from the other panelists today is that no matter where you're at, where your engagement efforts happen, from inner city Baltimore, which could not be more different from a cold camp in West Virginia, that the change can be slow.
And Dr. Heminger, anything to follow up with about how to maintain hope when these efforts are so long and slow moving?
I recently have started to describe my goal in life is to be a good surfer, right? Which is the highs, the good things that happen inside of our community are so beautiful and so transformative. And the things that, the difficult things that happen are just excruciating. And so my goal is just to stay on the board. And what has made that easier is I do feel like every single day I am given so much hope. And it's, a few weeks ago, we had one of our alumni from 17 years ago got married, and the person who officiated his wedding was one of his first Thread volunteers. A week apart from that, we had another Thread alumni from 20 years ago, who's now a staff member, marry a former staff member, where the wedding was officiated by another former Thread staff member. And so, I'm sitting there at the second wedding, and I lost it, not when the bride came in, I lost it when the groomsmen came in, because I looked at them and I saw a group of 14-year-old boys like playing around in the middle of the night at camp. Now they're grown men who have families and own companies and homes, and so they're just leading in so many different ways that they carry the hope with them, and that gives me so much energy. And it's just, even in our, to your point about youth, there's something that is Mary Alice, one of our current Thread members, is we were struggling with having enough Spanish speaking staff to enroll our most recent cohort. So Mary Alice came in and was literally the person who made that enrollment possible when we didn't have the capacity that we needed at the time. And now she was just recognized by the mayor for her efforts. So it's things like that where we do suffer tremendous loss, and there's just so much beauty, and you just try to hold it all at the same time, I think.
You all have given, I think, all of us a lot of hope and encouragement today, but just before our time ends, could you each quickly give a last piece of advice for anyone who might be in the audience interested in kind of engaging with the community, but might worry that they don't have anything to offer or aren't sure how to start? Maybe we can go in the same order as that previous question. So starting with you, Dr. Ziad.
I'm sorry, who did you say to start
Yes,
with?
you, sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. Sorry, back it up. Yeah, absolutely. I think that I would say, start with what everyone has something to offer. Let me just put it that way. That's just the starting point. Start with what you care about deeply and would be happy to give time to. So start with that. Just really think about that and giving time to something, right? Then, show up for things. I mean, this is really what I did, right? So, I mean, just show up for things, be an active participant and a doer in those activities, in those spaces where the things you care about are being discussed, are being advocated for, are being done. Be in relationship and in solidarity. Listen deeply in those spaces. Be a listener for some time. Just listen and see. And the listening, going back to what Angel was talking about, is because you're waiting to hear what is needed. You're not there to say, hey, I have all these skills, which I'm sure you do, all of us do. But those skills need to be matched with what is actually needed in the communities that you want to impact and be impacted by and work in solidarity with. So before even creating those formal bridges, listen, be there deeply, and start with also, who you might already know. So start with people you might know so that you have somebody who can support you and ease you into those spaces, who can also vouch for the fact that you are coming in, be aware of relationships of power. I think about that as a Hopkins person walking into spaces. I spent a lot of time before I got to Hopkins. I was in Baltimore for quite some time. I was already building those relationships for years before I moved into formal bridging between the university and the communities that I was working with. They already knew that I walked in with a sense of actually knowing them and caring about what they did and having already done things with them before I walked in as a, hey, can we work together in a formal relationship with the university? So all of that, I would say all of that, and of course, happy to talk to anyone who wants to reach out at any point and give any advice.
Well, I think that was a great summary of a lot of the themes we've touched on today, and I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we'll have to leave it there for today. So thank you again, Dr. Heminger, Dr. Ziad, and Dr. Smothers, for sharing your time and your experiences and your wisdom today. And I'm excited to see how all of this is put into action with our attendees. And just a reminder, we're going to have a brief break, and in about 10 minutes, we're going to have 2 panels offered, one being My Unconventional Odyssey, exploring non-traditional career paths for PhDs, and then From Outsider to Insider, finding my authentic voice in an unfamiliar space. So we hope to see you all there. Thanks so much.